and thank you for joining us at the 26th Conference of the Parties of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We're together, not just those of us who are in this room, but countless others around the world, because we're being live streamed at the same moment. And we may, in fact, hear from some of those people later when we turn to your questions. In terms of the headsets, there aren't any because of the fact that we're not using simultaneous translation. I'm Rob Stavins, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm director of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, which is sponsoring this event with two other institutions, the Enel Foundation and the Foundation Environment Law Society. I'll start with a brief introductory comment, and that is that the Paris Climate Agreement was clearly, at least I think, a major accomplishment, but there are really two necessary conditions for its ultimate success. One is adequate scope of participation, and that seems to have been achieved, certainly. And the other is adequate ambition of the individual national contributions, of course. The irony is that the very element of the Paris Agreement that fostered such broad scope of participation, 97% of global emissions associated with participating countries compared with 14% under the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, the very element that fostered that broad participation, namely the structure of nationally determined contributions that are anchored in national circumstances and domestic political realities, that virtually means that the individual contributions themselves are not going to live up to the hopes and aspirations of many people. They're not going to be judged to be sufficient because this is a global commons problem, and therefore, of course, every party that participates incurs the full costs of participation, of reducing emissions, but the benefits of reducing emissions are spread globally. So a key question has become, are there ways to enable and to facilitate greater ambition over time? Those of you who follow the Paris Agreement know that the so-called ratchet mechanism in the Paris Agreement is the device intended to achieve that. But there's still the question of how ambitious will the individual NDCs actually be? Are there ways to facilitate those NDCs really becoming more stringent, not just at least what they were in the previous period, but substantially more ambitious as we move from one period to another, whether that's the current 5-year schedule or if the parties decide to go to a briefer schedule, such as 1 year, as is being talked about. Now, one approach that can help is international linkage of regional, national, and even subnational policies from different parts of the world. And by linkage, what I simply mean are connections among policy systems in different jurisdictions that allow for emission reductions efforts to be redistributed across systems voluntarily. And the reason why that is so important is that such linkage can reduce cost dramatically and thereby facilitate greater ambition. As you may know, studies that came out from the Environmental Defense Fund and from the International Emissions Trading Association and the University of Maryland validated in their simulations how dramatic the cost reductions and the increase in ambition could thereby be if one maintained aggregate cost. Now, linkage is typically thought of as being between cap and trade systems, but of course, regional, national, and subnational policies are going to be highly heterogeneous. There will be a smaller number that use cap and trade systems, including, importantly, of course, the European Union, ETS. But there are many parts of the world, Northern Europe may be using carbon taxes. Most parts of the world will probably use performance standards or technology standards for that matter. But in work we've done at the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, going back 6 or 7 years now, and we've presented at previous COPs, we've shown how linkage can be between and among diverse policy instruments, including not only cap and trade, but also carbon taxes and performance standards. But if national governments do indeed establish such linkages, as have happened in the past and is anticipated will happen in the future, and if firms within a pair of jurisdictions that are linked then to decide to actually engage in some kind of trade, some kind of exchange of credits and responsibilities, then it's going to be very important to attribute those emissions reductions correctly to the right party in regard to its achievement of its NDC target. In particular, it will be important to avoid double counting. This is where Article 6, and in particular Article 6.2, the way I've characterized it, this is where it comes in as an accounting mechanism to true up if there are such linkages and there are such trades from one country to another, to true up and to make sure that things are being properly accounted for. And as we'll hear, and as you may already know, the Article 6.2 itself already has mechanisms, the internationally transferable mitigation options, the Itmos, has mechanisms that can function as such accounting mechanisms. Now, as most of you probably already also know, is that in order to implement the Paris Agreement overall, the negotiators had to go through a process of adopting more detailed rules for each part of the agreement. This is the so-called rule book of the Paris Agreement, which of course is complete except for Article 6. So here at COP26 in Glasgow, the parties to the Paris Agreement are again attempting for the third time to write rules for implementing Article 6. And in today's event, what we're doing is examining the potential of Article 6 and its prospects at COP26 and beyond, with particular focus on what are the points of controversy and disagreement, and what are potential landing points where things could be worked out so that the rule book could be completed. And we're doing this with three wonderful experts on Article 6 and on market mechanisms more broadly. We're going to hear at the beginning from Michael Mehling, who's the Deputy Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the United States. He's done a tremendous amount of research previously and again very recently on Article 6 and on its implementation. Now, unfortunately, Kelley Kizzier, who's an expert on Article 6 as well, former negotiator, former co-lead of the Article 6 negotiations, and now Vice President for Global Climate at EDF, could not be with us because of a last-minute commitment. As you know, this comes up regularly during these COPs. But also Ms. Mandy Rambaros, who's the General Manager of Just Energy Transition, Escol Holdings, the largest South African power company, who has followed the Article 6 negotiations closely for many years, and the larger UNFCCC process for that matter. She also had something come up, and so likewise was unable to be with us. But fortunately, we have a single individual who's so good that he can stand in for two people who weren't here. And I'm referring, of course, to Martin Hessian, who is the chief Article 6 negotiator for the European Union. And we appreciate very much that he has stepped away from all these ongoing discussions to be with us for as much of this session as is possible. And then finally, last but not least, Daniele Agostini, who is the head of low carbon and European energy policies for the Enel Group, and who also follows the broad negotiations as well as particular focus on Article 6 very closely for a long time. Now, a brief word about logistics, and then I'll finally turn to our first presentation. If you would like to follow the work of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements and be on our mailing list, we won't inundate you with material. We send out emails about once a month or every other month about our research. What you could do is just give us a business card, but because of COVID, rather than trying to hand it to one of us, we've put a little bag right over here on the stage. If you leave early, feel free to walk up and drop your business card on top or inside, or at the end, you could do that. The next bit of logistics is that there are 4 microphones that are set up at various parts of the room. It'll be a bit of time from now that I'll turn to your questions. If you have one, a question or a comment, just make your way to one of the microphones. And then I'll also be looking to see if questions are coming in from the YouTube live streaming. And then the final logistical comment is an apology, and that is because of a last-minute change in airplane schedules, I need to make my way to Glasgow Airport, and so about 15 minutes before we're scheduled to end, I am going to, I hope, unobtrusively make my way off of the stage. But the co-director of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, Dr. Robert Stowe, will then take over the moderation and at the end bring things to a close in excellent fashion, I'm sure. So with that, I'm pleased to turn to my sometime co-author and a longtime colleague, Michael Mehling, who is going to start us off with a brief presentation on the prospects for Article 6 at COP26. Michael?
Thank you very much, Rob. Thanks to the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements and the Enel Foundation for sponsoring this event. And as Rob just mentioned, I will try to run us through 3 topics essentially in a 20-minute presentation roughly. So the potential of Article 6 and why it matters, then some of the difficult issues that negotiators are trying to resolve during this 3rd attempt to conclude the Paris Agreement work program on Article 6, meaning operationalize it, and then finally also look at different outcomes that could come from the negotiations, including failure to reach compromise. What would that mean, especially from an international law perspective? So I presume that anybody who's watching or in the room probably knows what Article 6 represents, but for anybody who might not be fully caught up, I'll try to quickly define it. It's essentially, it's one provision in the Paris Agreement that contains 3 mechanisms for voluntary cooperation between parties. It sets out 3 channels for cooperation, 2 of which are commonly considered to be the newest, sort of the latest iteration of the use of carbon markets in international climate cooperation. The first of those is cooperative approaches, the transfer of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, which Rob Stavins already spoke about in Article 6, paragraphs 2 and 3. The second is the creation of a new crediting mechanism, which is sometimes referred to as the Sustainable Development Mechanism, although it's not, that language is not used in the Paris Agreement, in Article 6, paragraphs 4 to 7. And finally, there are several additional paragraphs at the end of the provision, Article 6, paragraphs 8 and 9, that set out a framework for non-market approaches. Those are also being negotiated concurrently here at COP26. It's a very different type of cooperation, and so I'm not going to go into any depth, which does not suggest that they're any less important, of course, than the 2 market-based approaches in Article 6, paragraph 2 and 4. Also worth mentioning, if you do a search in the Paris Agreement for markets, you will not find it except in the context of non-market approaches. So parties explicitly left out the word markets, which sort of already indicates the disagreements or the level of sort of underlying disagreements already in COP21 in 2015. And it's no surprise perhaps that Article 6 was the last provision in the Paris Agreement to be agreed. Quickly, why Article 6 is important, so why there has been a lot of discussion around it and why the stakes are high, including here at this conference of the parties, or rather meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. There's been a number of different studies, Rob Stavins has already briefly mentioned them, that suggest and that model, use quantitative modeling, that suggests that like with other market-based approaches for environmental or climate policy, using these kinds of flexible cooperation through markets can dramatically help reduce the cost of mitigation in this case, or if you look at it from the other side, because you can achieve more at the same cost, you can increase the ambition without additional cost. One study, probably the latest, coming out of this cooperation of IETA and the University of Maryland and some other partners, suggested that the savings could be up to 50% roughly of the estimated cost to achieve currently pledged NDCs without Article 6. So you could reduce by half roughly the cost of achieving these NDCs, which, looked at from the other side, means you could double the ambition under these NDCs without additional cost. And given the emissions gap, the ambition gap that we have, constantly been reminded of through a number of studies, most recently with the emissions gap report of UNEP, any such opportunity is bitterly needed. So this is why Article 6 matters and why many say it is a crucial element of ambition in the Paris Agreement. There's another side to it, of course, because it's premised on or would create the ability to trade between parties as part of voluntary cooperation. It can also contribute to carbon finance. In fact, the same modeling study or the same group of researchers have modeled the size of potential transactions under Article 6 by 2050 and estimated that this could result in transfers of up to $1 trillion per year, which, if we recall, the climate finance gap that we have, not just in north-south transfers under climate finance obligations in the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, but also, of course, the broader investment gap, investments in mitigation in order to achieve the necessary transformation to stay within the temperature stabilization targets of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Again, any such additional source of finance would be extremely useful. The stakes are also high because a number of parties have already indicated their intention to rely on Article 6 as a source of finance or as a flexible means of achieving their NDCs at lower cost. Way more than half, so almost 90% of parties. So this again indicates that this is an important debate, but all of this with the caveat that if Article 6 is operationalized in a way that undermines integrity, that allows, for instance, for accounting that, double counting, for instance, as Rob Stavins mentioned, then of course any ambition gains might be undermined, and in fact, the entire Paris Agreement's ambition cycle could be severely undermined. So this is sort of the tension, these are the stakes in play in operationalizing Article 6. The negotiations are focused on fleshing out the many ambiguities, the many vague and sort of open-ended terms in Article 6, based on a mandate contained in the paragraphs of the Article 6 and the accompanying decision CP121 that accompanied adoption of the Paris Agreement. The subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice has been mandated with sort of preparing the technical language for decisions by the CMA that would then set out guidance for Article 6.2 and rules, modalities, and procedures for Article 6.4. And as Rob Stavins mentioned, we've twice tried to conclude this agenda item of the POP, of the Paris Agreement Work Program, and twice parties have failed to ultimately reach agreement on these two decisions, well, and also, of course, on Article 6.8. And there has been no formal proposal before this week since December 2019, when the COP25 presidency, so Chile in Madrid, if you like, had 3 iterations of negotiating texts on each of these provisions. And although there have been technical meetings, informal technical and informal consultations in 2020 and 2021, we've not really had negotiating texts until this week. These meetings over the course of the pandemic, of course, that's the reason why we have been prevented from having more formal discussions, have been constructive, but we've also seen a number of the same issues that already created divisions in Madrid and in Katowice be reiterated by the parties. A lot of familiar divides or fault lines keep coming up. And so now that we're halfway through COP26, halfway to the second week of COP26, I think it's fair to say that we still cannot say that we will have decisions on all 3 mechanisms in Article 6 at the end of this week. And My interpretation of where things stand, but I'm not a negotiator, and Martin will hopefully correct me if I got anything wrong. Last week, we saw a number of new iterations of informal technical text coming out in the substance negotiations. These have then transitioned to the political phase of the COP, sort of a recurring pattern in every COP, of course. Now ministers will be charged with, or heads of delegations and ministers charged with addressing those intractable political divisions that have prevented agreement previously. This week, we have seen ministers from Norway and Singapore be charged with, mandated by the COP26 presidency, so Alok Sharma, with facilitating negotiations on precisely those issues that need political guidance, and I'll list them in a moment. And today, we saw the release of new proposed draft CMA decisions for Article 6.2, 6.4, and Article 6.8. And in the informal stocktake plenary just a few hours ago, the message was from one of these two ministerial facilitators was that there's a good spirit and that there's a strong commitment to concluding this week at COP26. Martin Hessian might tell us how accurate that optimism is or how justified. Quickly to the paper that Rob Stavins already referenced. So this is a paper that came out about a month ago, and it tries to zero in on precisely those fault lines that are primarily political, not technical in nature, analyzing the different positions of different parties and party groupings, and also the implications, the arguments used by each side, and the implications of some of the landing zones or bridging options that would facilitate potentially compromise to allow parties to agree. The three issues that have been singled out for these ministerial consultations because they would benefit from political guidance are accounting for Article 6.4 outside the scope of host party NDCs. This is to prevent double counting, the question whether or not a corresponding adjustment would be needed when emissions reductions under 6.4 occur outside the scope of NDCs. Then the share of proceeds under Article 6.2, which does not mention it in the Paris Agreement text itself, and yet some parties feel like it has to also be levied from Article 6.2 Itmo Transfers, so generating finance for adaptation. And finally, the third and perhaps the most contentious issue, although I'm sure that's debatable, is what to do with unused Kyoto-era units, especially CERs issued under the Clean Development Mechanism or still to be issued under the Clean Development Mechanism towards NDCs, if at all. There are many other issues, so I don't want to suggest that these are the only ones that matter. There's debates about OMGE, the overall mitigation in global emissions, whether that should also apply under 6.2, other uses of ITMOs, the voluntary carbon market in particular, human rights safeguards, baselines and additionality, and a host of other issues. And Martin can probably, well, I'm sure he would roll his eyes on how many brackets there still are in the text that we have now. But I'll focus on these three. And for each of these issues, in fact, two more that I won't go into detail given time, in the paper you can sort of find a description, why there's disagreement, which parties and what arguments are being used by these parties in terms of resolving those disagreements, some compromise options, bridging options that have been proposed, for instance, by the chair of the subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice and co-facilitators in the negotiations, and finally a bit of analysis on each of these issues. And it's supported by an annex in which all the written statements, at least in submissions by parties, have been compiled as kind of the basis for interpreting where parties have stood over the last 2 years and how views have evolved. The first one, crediting of efforts outside the scope of NDCs. And the question really is whether or not parties can be allowed to credit emissions reductions that are not included in their NDC. And if so, do they at least have to apply a corresponding adjustment, meaning in the double ledger accounting system of the Paris Agreement, would the balance of each party have to be adjusted, the emissions balance accordingly, to avoid double counting? And there's been a range of positions, as you might imagine. Some parties feel that there should be absolutely no crediting outside of parties' NDCs, although I think positions have softened, but at least earlier on that was one position. Two, full crediting should be allowed without any conditions. And there have been a number of bridging options or compromise options proposed somewhere in between. For instance, the crediting should be allowed, but always require a corresponding adjustment, or slightly softer, slightly more towards those who think that no corresponding adjustment should be needed. It might only be required after an opt-out period, so starting from a certain date. And whereas the COP25 version or iteration 3 text had still suggested that, emissions reductions outside the scope of NDCs would be possible, but they would require corresponding adjustment after an opt-out period. Today's text that was released in the morning shows all options essentially still on the table. So as you can see, it's a bracketed option, not covered by NDCs, emissions reduction. The whole thing is bracketed, shall apply, but of course, that means the whole provision there, the whole para 74B is an option, essentially. And then there's also the options of having these opt-out dates. In fact, there's still even disagreement what it means to be outside the scope of NDCs. Some parties have creatively suggested that even activities that are not included in the NDC or necessary to achieve the NDC would already be outside of the scope of an NDC, whereas most parties, I think, agree that it's really supposed to cover or refer to sectors and gases covered in the NDC. That was the first of three issues I'll highlight. The second one is applying share of proceeds. So this is essentially applying a provision that is definitely mandatory for Article 6.4 for the crediting mechanism, whether that should mutatis mutandis essentially apply to Article 6.2, Itmo transfers, meaning that a certain percentage of the revenue, if you like, of an Itmo transfer would then be levied, or of units, and then be commercialized and flow into, for instance, the adaptation fund. And again, views across parties differ widely. Some are pretty categorically opposed to that, partly with arguments that, for instance, linked emissions trading systems such as the California-Quebec link or the EU-Switzerland link would become inordinately less attractive and potentially even, it would be difficult to have them continue functioning as they have in the past if parties would additionally have to, parties to transactions, apply a share of proceeds to each of these transactions or at the end of the year, for instance. Other parties, however, especially in the developing world, feel like, well, to provide predictable adaptation finance, but also to ensure that there is a level playing field, if you like, equal footing between 6.2 and 6.4, it has to be also applied to 6.2. And the compromise here between these two sort of more extreme positions could be, and has been proposed by the COP25 presidency, for instance, to make it voluntary, but to strongly encourage commitment to applying a share of proceeds, yet still giving parties some flexibility to decide where it makes sense and where not. And again, I think the decision this morning, reflective of more generally what's happened with the negotiating text over the past 8-9 days, has added again some of the options that COP25 presidency had suggested to eliminate, but of course then failed to obtain consensus because some parties did not feel it reflected their priorities. So we have, for instance, in options shall, making it mandatory, but that's an option, so it could also be voluntary, but then the strongly encouraged language and the commit to language, and then some modalities of how these proceeds could then be channeled towards adaptation. And the final of these three sort of particularly thorny political issues is the transition of pre-2020 Kyoto units, especially CERs. The question being, should certified emission reductions that have already been issued or could be issued in legacy projects and legacy activities be eligible for use towards NDCs within the framework of the Paris Agreement? And again, the spectrum of views and positions is from no transition whatsoever to full transition allowed, and then parties have sort of come up with, and the able facilitators of negotiations, with some bridging zones that could allow compromise between these positions. The COP25 text still suggested a conditional transition with things like cutoff dates for project registration, unit issuance and use. The latest text this morning essentially sets out all options again, which shall not be used or may be used, but then conditional again on cutoff dates or on qualitative restrictions, and then a number of conditions such as what the timeline of, like the cutoff date of project registration could be 2013, 2016, or the issuance cutoff dates, the use cutoff dates. So there's a number of different options still on the table, and this is what has to be narrowed down over the next few days if we want guidance on Article 6.4. So To conclude that second part of my presentation and move to the third one, what does this all mean? This is my attempt, really, and it's a subjective or personal one, to say, what does this mean for compromise? And also, what might happen if we don't have compromise despite the best efforts this week? So the starting point of that is, of course, that we already had some bridging options or some compromise proposals 2 years ago in Madrid, and yet it obviously wasn't enough to bring all parties on board. The decisive question is, have views changed in the last 24 months to warrant agreement now in Glasgow? And I think one very important thing that has happened is that there's clearly been much better understanding of some of the implications of these options. I distinctly recall in December 2019 when the issue of transition of CERs came to the table, to the fore, and then overnight an NGO published an analysis that suggested that if we allow unrestricted transition of CERs, we might be looking at 4 to 5 gigatons of legacy units swamping the Paris Agreement framework and undermining ambition. Since then, we've had a number of additional analyses, all of which suggest, and this is a presentation of the UNFCCC Secretariat a few weeks ago to help facilitate the negotiations, all of which suggest as soon as you include certain cutoff periods, for instance, you dramatically narrow down, dramatically reduce the amount of units in question. So that is, I think, very useful, and parties have expressed appreciation of having much better understanding of the implications. And yet, even when it comes to things like cutoff dates, 2013, 2016, maybe a date outside of those frameworks, registration dates, issue dates, use dates, and so on, compromises will be needed. So there's still a lot of political work to be done. Hence, we have these consultations now. And new issues have come up, for instance, other uses of Itmos, and other issues could still come up. It's not excluded the parties bring in suddenly things that had been considered resolved because they're not happy with the overall balance of where things stand. And this could shift battlefronts. So there's definitely still risks, but again, I think the spirit is there to really, third time is the charm, to get decisions by the end of the week. Yet there is probably, as always, a slim chance that there could be a failure to compromise. And as an international lawyer, and I can't recall, I think, Martin, you're a lawyer too, we learn in international law that the basic principle of international cooperation is unless parties voluntarily concede sovereignty on an issue through treaties or state practice, which becomes custom, they're essentially free to do what they want within their territory. And in that sort of spirit, it would at least suggest, and this is, I think, something that most parties probably largely agreed to, is that Article 6.2 could proceed without guidance on Article 6.2 coming out of CMA. Article 6 piloting activities are underway. In fact, there's studies that already try to sort of quantify and survey all the different activities that are out there. The UNEP-DTU partnership, and I saw Karen Holm-Olsen just earlier in the previous event, they're maintaining a database, and there's already 45 pilot activities. And another survey suggests that up to 1.3 billion, roughly, US dollars have been committed to these pilot activities. So there's clearly already movement, and it's mostly Article 6.2. Most of it early stage preparation, but it shows that parties have an appetite to move forward even in the absence of operational details. Article 6.4 is a different story. It requires centralized governance, including a supervisory body, and without the rules, modalities, and procedures, if they're not adopted by the CMA, it is not conceivable, really, that Article 6.4 would become operational. So in the last 20 seconds, I'll conclude with some takeaways. I think, the starting point is parties did, despite disagreements, agree to have Article 6 in the Paris Agreement. There is a desire to have this mechanism for volunteer cooperation, but they clearly stated it has to be for higher ambition and to promote environmental integrity. And that's really, that balance between prescriptiveness and flexibility is what's at stake in the negotiations. It's important to also recall that market approaches and flexibility by themselves do not create ambition. They only enable more ambition by reducing the cost and unlocking finance. And so the logical conclusion of that is that neither the most restrictive nor the most permissive outcomes would actually be the most favorable for greatest ambition. Because if it's too restrictive, if it's entirely skewed towards preventing any kind of violation of any kind of sort of environmental integrity concerns, then it probably will be so unattractive that nobody takes advantage of the opportunities that Article 6 offers. And conversely, if it's too lax, then of course we also undermine ambition. So balanced outcome is needed, and I think that means accounting has to be absolutely robust, but on some other issues we have seen that there are compromise or bridging options, and I hope that during the remaining days of COP26, compromise will not be considered a defeat, because actually it is necessary to leverage the potential of Article 6. Thank you very much.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. I want to mention, to highlight the fact that you'll notice that at one point he put up a image of the actual paper itself, and that paper is available. You know, because of the policies nowadays of the COPs to not bring a lot of paper here, we don't have copies to pass out to you. However, it is available to you. If you go to the website of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, go to the research section, you'll find the paper, and right now, and in a few days, you'll also find a copy of his entire slide deck if you'd like to have that as well. So we encourage you to follow up with that if you're interested. You'll also find at the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements website lots of previous papers, research we've done, which is directly related to this, to the subject of linkage among heterogeneous types of policies in different jurisdictions. And now we're privileged to turn to Martin Hessian, the Chief Article 6 negotiator for the European Union, for his reactions, and we hope also an update on what's actually going on here with Article 6.
Okay, hello everybody, and thanks for being here to listen. I guess your first question is, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be somewhere else? And that's possibly true, but there are ongoing negotiations. We're just in a bit of a pause at the moment, and there are 27 member states in the EU, so we have plenty of experts going around trying to fix and bridge different bits of the text as we speak. I'm slightly terrified I'm going to get a phone call. Also, I think we are going into ministerial consultations tonight on the outstanding bits of the text, so we're pretty well prepared already, and you know, we're not really going to move forward until those start. First of all, I'd like to say you've got it pretty spot on in terms of the issues that are on the table. I might have a slightly different balance of other issues than perhaps you suggested, but the analysis is pretty spot on. What's different this time from Madrid? I think markets are fundamentally difficult. If you take the time to read the texts that are currently on the table, there's a lot of technicality. They're very long, and there's a lot of interlinkage with other areas. So it takes a long time to actually digest what it is that we need to do. Myself and Kelley, who you miss, we were two of the negotiators that did a deal with Brazil in Paris that I think led to Article 6 happening. And at the time, we knew the general direction of what needed to happen. Paris is quite different from the Kyoto Protocol. The targets are different. And we adopted an emissions-based approach to accounting, as well as a mechanism that was framed within the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And while in outline those things are pretty simple to understand, when one tries to implement them, given the diversity of target types and given the challenges of designing baselines, etc., around net zero, it's really, really difficult. So it's taken a long time for us to digest the consequences of what we agreed, I think, and turn it into workable technical solutions. I think where we are now, we're no further on, in a sense, with respect to the three big issues. From a European Union perspective, they're all asks. They're all potential reductions in ambition. The carryover of substantial project activities will add nothing to ambition this decade, and we know this conference is all about delivering on further ambition in this decade. The issue with the counting and the potential for double counting is very significant, and it's not something that we find very easy to think that there could be exemptions or delays in the implementation of accounting because of the risks to ambition there. On the share of the proceeds, it's slightly different in the sense that it's an issue of how much, when this market is working, how much finance might be derived from those markets and delivered for adaptation. The text in Paris didn't agree it, and parties are very, very divided as to whether we could take on a responsibility on the 6.2 side to deliver that finance. We've been somewhat in the middle. We're not in favour of compulsory levies, as there are on 6.4. We recognise that having nothing on the table is probably not acceptable, so we're working towards some middle ground option there. So on the three thermometers that you had, I think we're fairly environmentally integral and very strict. On the far end, on the first two, and on share the proceeds, we're somewhere in the middle. The question is, how do we broker a deal that everybody goes home happy with? And so we've worked in the last 2 years to, it's always been our position that the 6.4 mechanism needs to be more ambitious. The problem with the Paris text is that we had no clear references and ambition there. So we've worked, particularly at this conference, to build a broad coalition around having a much more ambitious mechanism to replace the CDM. We've also worked to build understanding that the CDM needs to close, as is our legal opinion. So there's a negotiation going on about closure of the CDM, which wasn't mentioned, and a negotiation about a much more ambitious mechanism, which gives us greater confidence that we can get a balanced outcome if we deliver on those elements of the text. So in the 6.4 text, there's two options on the design of the mechanism. Option A is ours, option B is the less ambitious one, and it's currently being negotiated or traded for different concessions. I can't say a lot about how the trade-offs are being formulated, because there are still different views as to what might be traded between one another. But what I will say is that we have a broad coalition of parties that want to see the most ambitious outcome possible. I'm fairly confident that that is the view that will prevail. It won't be without flexibility. And the way in which we're describing it at the moment is that we can have some short-term flexibility on some of these options, but it can't be at the expense of designing a mechanism that actually works for the future. And the short-term flexibility needs to be fairly short-term, because we know that we need to deliver in the next 10 years. And that's basically where we are. I don't know what more to say about it. I'm sure maybe you can ask me questions about how that works. Maybe to understand how the negotiations work a little, we're the European Union and work together as a group. We have partners in the San Jose Principles group, which is a range of progressive parties that have launched principles about what the market should look like. We're also working with parties that we don't agree with, which is the nature of negotiation, to try and moderate their demands and ensure that we get that strong framework that we would like to have in return for concessions to them, and trying to make it all work together. So I kind of think we're not going to have a perfect agreement, not the agreement that I would write or that you would write if it were possible. But we will have, and I'm fairly confident the mood is fairly good, that we will have something at the end of this that we can be proud of. It's not done yet. Our ministers have to work hard to deliver on the political issues that we've defined. I think I was describing it to my son yesterday as I've created all the Lego bricks, now that they have to put it together and make something out of it. Hopefully those bricks will be put together in a way that it's a recognizable product and an ambitious product, but that's what we're going to be working through the night tonight to do, and possibly tomorrow as well. So why I'm here, I would normally be asleep in a darkened room waiting for the next meeting. I was taking my shoes off because my feet are sore. There's a lot of walking involved in negotiation. And we're having a bit of downtime before we go into negotiations tonight. But anyway, I'm open to questions, and I hope that was broadly comprehensible.
Great, thank you very much, Martin. So, you know, there are three perspectives that we have here really on the Lego bricks. We first heard from a legal scholar, so an academic perspective, and now we've heard the government perspective from a negotiator. And of course, the other sector that's quite interested in Article 6 is the private sector, the compliance entities who ultimately bear the responsibilities for reducing emissions. And so for that, I'm pleased to turn for your comments and your thoughts to Daniele Agostini, who is from the Enel Foundation and has also had long experience monitoring and watching these negotiations. So Daniele.
Yeah, thank you, Rob, and thank you, Michael. I think you guys did a great job with this research paper that really summarizes and makes the negotiations a lot more accessible. I spent a lot of time with Martin in the past navigating some of these issues, but the clarity with which, Michael, you were able to map them out, it's really comforting, and I think it makes people really realize the challenges that we're facing in these Article 6 negotiations, which hopefully will come to a successful close. As far as we go in Enel, we're looking at the closures of Article 6 as a big opportunity. Opportunity a bit like it goes with the title of this event of enhancing ambition. At the moment, as the Enel Group, we're already committed to a very high level of ambition. Our targets are SBTi certified. We're phasing out coal by 2027 at the global level. We're tripling our renewables and going to 150 gigawatts by 2030. We're looking at accelerating this using these market mechanisms. For us, these market mechanisms, we see the strong cost reductions that, Michael, you were talking about. I mean, those $300 billion are very attractive. There is a big issue of how we distribute those benefits. And so we do realize why the negotiations get so political. How are those benefits going to be shared among the different parties? As a private sector operator, we're not so much looking at those benefits because we do have the resources, we're able to mobilize them. For us, we're looking at the cooperation that Article 6 is going to trigger. Those benefits are going to allow stakeholders to come together on the ground, local government, local project developers, to accelerate the way we can actually build projects. We have a strong pipeline. We just need to accelerate it, and this Article 6 can catalyze action. So for us, we're really looking at the cooperation part more than at the market. Within this context, I think the issues that you brought up, Michael, are very interesting, are very relevant. Some of them, of course, are more political, and on those, as an Enel Group and a foundation, obviously we have less of a strong view because that's not what we should be looking at. But if I look at some of those that instead are more dear to my heart, I can go through them and just reflect some of our own thinking on this. The first one, of course, is the NDC and the corresponding adjustment. We're very supportive of strong environmental integrity, and so in that sense, we fully support the European Union position. We believe that it is key that we find an outcome here in Glasgow on this issue. There's a lot of movement out there, a lot of initiatives in developing countries, in emerging economies, and often struggle to understand where these projects can be created, in which sectors. So strong guidance on how these projects will take place and what are the implications are very important. We see at the same time a blossoming voluntary market that does need guidance. It needs guidance to understand these credits that are being created on the voluntary market, how they will be interacting with the compliance market of the Paris Agreement. And so in that sense, it is important that that guidance arrives and arrives by the end of the week. Of course, it needs to respect the national sovereignty that you were talking about, Michael. So we have to have clear rules, we have to respect that sovereignty, but there has to be strong guidance on what can be allowed at the national level and what cannot be allowed. Of course, share of proceeds is a very important issue. It goes again on how the benefits will be shared across the global community, a very political one on which, again, we do not have specific views, but it needs to be very transparent. So transparency is the key, and the solution needs to make sure that there's full accountability, full transparency. The issue instead of the legacy units is a very important one. It's an important one because it talks about legal certainty of something that was created. Investors had expectations. So it is important that that solution does respect the reasonable expectations that investors investors had at the time in which to mobilize those resources. Now, of course, investors have their own risks, so this deciding, what is the cutoff date is a very important one. We've also seen in the past these market mechanisms almost running the risk of failing because of excess volumes entering the system. We've seen it with the CDM. We've seen it also currently in the UETS with the surplus and the MSR, the mechanism that actually manages excessive generation of surplus on the market. So it is important, and in that sense, we are cautious. I would hope, I don't think it's possible in the text today, but I would hope that in the work program that follows, we also try to implement some more dynamic mechanisms that can monitor as these volumes are delivered and calibrate how much of this volume actually enters, because diluting the effort would be a big problem. And again, we've seen this in the past. It's mechanisms that have been implemented in other spaces. I'm thinking of the renewable energy mechanisms, where again, all the current mechanisms that are operating in the world look at the volumes and adjust the rules as long as the rules are predictable and transparent. So very important. I'll move on to the ensuring overall mitigation on global emissions. Again, very political. We support the spirit. Of course, defining the letter is very hard. It will have to be a compromise. So I will not get more specific on that, but I'd like to instead comment very much on that fifth issue, which is the baselines. That is a key issue. We know it bogged down the mechanism the first time around, and in some way, and it failed it in many ways. In some directions, it created too much volumes. In others, it slowed down the process excessively. So again, it is important that that this issue is not addressed too much at the political level. It should be technical. It should be dynamic, and most of all, there needs to be a clear work program with a clear timeline on when these more detailed provisions will be defined. Because otherwise we run the risk of closing an agreement today, but then taking another 15 years to actually define the modalities through which these baselines will be calculated. Of course, it's complicated, even in this case. Dynamic baselines, evolving technologies make it a real challenge. And even here, we should be thinking of a dynamic way of defining these rules with review periods so that we can move along and adapt as the context change, rather than trying to get everything right today. It has to be precautionary. So of course, we need to make sure that there's a high level of environmental integrity, but we also have to understand that things will change very rapidly in the next 5 to 10 years. And so spending 5 years to define rules today that will be obsolete by the time they get implemented is also not a good way forward. So again, I'm very much looking forward to a positive outcome, but also a clear work program and a road ahead that gives clear timing so that the private sector can keep developing those pipeline of projects. And again, I want to emphasize that a lot of players like us, we're really looking at the cooperation with the stakeholders. These are going to be frameworks to enhance that cooperation on the ground that actually is going to allow us to deliver accelerated ambition at the global level. Thank you again for a very interesting study.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniele. And at this point now, we welcome your questions or your brief comments from everyone in the room or who are watching worldwide on the internet. We have 4 microphones set up to just make your way to one of those microphones, and I'll take them in order. And so microphone number 2, please. And if everyone who's asking a question, making a comment, tell us, so we know who we're talking with, tell us your name, your institution that you're affiliated with, and the country that you reside in, please. Sir.
Andreas Haupt, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I reside in the United States. I wanted to pick up on Mr. Agostini's last point, where he again stressed a concrete timeline that is needed to produce a pipeline. And I was interested in how policy uncertainty or timing of policies in the outlook, and then also the investment implications of that, whether there's uncertainty or certainty, how this interacts with the effectiveness of the whole process of refining Article 6.
Does anyone want to comment on that? So I will. No, I'd prefer the panelists, if any of you would like to.
Yeah, relying on the international system to regulate the details of the carbon market, I think is a big proposition. We've been told we've been delayed, and I think that's right. So we haven't maybe sent the clearest investment signals that one would like. I have colleagues back at home in Brussels that work to much stricter and more clear timetables. So I think there's an amount of uncertainty that's inevitable. The priority for us, though, is to get the rules right, because we can't come back and renegotiate this again constantly. So it's a bit of a one-off, really. We will, of course, be implementing and have a work program to implement the details of the things we agree. But it is taking time, because it's taken time for the world to adjust to the idea that we are going towards net zero, and the markets need to reflect that. And one thing perhaps I didn't say is that markets are a means to an end, and we need to make sure that this fits within a very clear framework of a trajectory to net zero, with all the complications involved of different parties doing different bits of that. So it just takes time, and we will try to fix the principles. We've got very short work programs, perhaps unrealistic work programs, but arguably to work program the principles into operational rules. So, yeah.
Just a comment on our side, we're not waiting. We already have our net zero well before 2040. The large players can deal with uncertainty. Where I think it has the biggest impact is on the small entrepreneurs on the ground, which they hear about these market instruments, but they never know when it's going to take off. And those are the ones that are most impacted, and that we need to instead support.
So, your question, I have to comment. I would like to comment, in other words. And that is, I think there's a lot of confusion in my mind regarding Article 6.2. That's the part that I'm thinking about. And that is, people seem to think about it sometimes, and the share of proceeds demonstrates this, that very phrase. What proceeds? If Article 6.2 is an accounting mechanism that's truing up, right, through the adjustments, is truing up, make sure that everyone's getting the right credit, we don't have double counting. The linkages were bilateral agreements between two jurisdictions, as the European Union has done with Switzerland, as California has done with Quebec. And then the trading, where there's finance, that's between two compliance entities that may be the same corporation or maybe two different companies in two different jurisdictions. That's where there's some money. Unless what one wants to do is to make Article 6.2 into a reproduction of Article 17 from the Kyoto Protocol, in which case it will fail as that did. Because countries are not cost minimizers, they don't have the information to engage in those kinds of cost-effective trades. And I sometimes feel like a broken record, because I've been saying this since the Paris Agreement was formulated, but I constantly hear things that people seem to be thinking. I'm not saying you, sir, at all, but it's thinking of 6.2 as if there were going to be some financial trades between countries. And if there are, it's going to fail. That's my 2 cents, and now you get your 10 cents. Microphone number 3, please.
Hi there. So my name is Colin Malden. I work for the University of Bristol, the University of Oxford, and St Anna School of Advanced Studies. And my question concerns climate clubs and climate alliances. So will proto-climate clubs and alliances such as the San Jose Principles be able to maintain their higher ambitions if the Article 6 rulebook is concluded with a compromise which is unfavourable for maximising ambition?
Would anyone like to comment on how does Article 6 relate to the emergence of climate clubs?
Yeah, a direct answer to the question is I don't think so. I think there is a coalition of interests around high integrity and high ambition in markets. I think the UNFCCC rules will always be a compromise among those that are not part of that sort of coalition. And I think the San Jose Principles were an attempt, I think, initially at least, and are still remain an attempt to define what high ambition is for these rules. But they illustrate that there is not just a developed country, but a developed and a developing country interest on the part of buyers and sellers to deliver something of quality. So I can't see it being undermined. I hear an Irish accent and I want to speak some Gaelic, so as they say. Yeah.
Michael Mehling is going to follow up, but I'm going to beg your forgiveness. As I said at the beginning, I need to go to the airport, but my Harvard colleague, Dr. Robert Stowe, will continue to moderate the session for our remaining time. So.
Safe travels, Rob.
Please.
I'll be 5 minutes, I can do, but good luck. Make the airplane.
So my response would be also to remember Article 6 is an enabling framework. And the fact that, for instance, you have Quebec and California or the EU and Switzerland linking with significantly higher requirements on the integrity and the operational framework of each of these markets is not going to be prevented just because Article 6, or watered down because Article 6 might, on a global level, have a lower sort of integrity threshold, let's say. So parties can still adopt significantly more ambitious operational requirements in their cooperation. And in fact, what we're seeing is that those very same parties that have higher requirements, let's say, are also accompanying such frameworks with, for instance, unilateral border carbon adjustment mechanisms in order to ensure that they don't then suffer negative consequences such as emissions leakage. I know we were hoping we would have one event where the CBAM was not brought in, but you sort of tempted me too much there.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
There was, I think, one. No?
Do you see one that I don't see, Michael?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, come up to the mic, yeah.
Ronaldo Serra da Mota from the State University of Rio de Janeiro. Brazil has made a proposal for a period of transition, and some countries could sell 6.4 credits without corresponding adjustment. But when I read the last text, I cannot see properly this period of transition. How does it be wrapped up within there, or has it not been considered?
That sounds like a Barton question, maybe.
Yeah, I think you need to look at paragraph 74B of the 6.2 text from 1 o'clock in the morning last night. I think you'll find that proposal is there. It's just quite small compared with the rest of the text. It's not small in terms of implication, but it's there in a very neat way on the text. I have to say that we don't agree with it, but there you go.
I assume there are no other contributions yet.
Well, I could
Any
comment
other
on it.
questions, please? Okay, good, very good.
Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you so much for inviting us. I'm Pinaki. I'm from India, Delhi, and I'm a scholar at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. My question is basically the sense of urgency regarding Article 6 and how it is going to affect the NDCs in particular, because if I'm not wrong, I heard that 87% of the countries are depending on Article 6 and outcomes for meeting their NDCs. So does that mean a kind of, again, a time delay, and that is going to cost us how much billions of dollars and livelihood? Thank you.
Who'd like to take that? Michael.
I would take it as a clarification, perhaps. So in the slide where I referenced the UNFCCC Secretariat's NDC synthesis report, which now has come out in 3 versions, a 3rd version, it was only showing the number of NDCs that indicate an intention or interest in using Article 6, but not reliance on Article 6 in order to. It's not like a condition for the NDCs, which I think is a very, very important distinction.
Yeah, I'd like to agree with that. I think those indications may be as seller as opposed to buyer. And it's certainly our view that the NDCs are not ambitious enough to drive a very large market at the moment. We're not asking for more ambitious NDCs to drive a market. We're doing it so that we get on a pathway to 1.5. But one of the issues around expectations on markets, I think you need to look very firmly at the NDCs and what sort of demand they're delivering. And I probably should comment for people that don't know that the EU is not going to be buying extensively abroad, because our calculation to get on a pathway to neutrality by mid-century, we need to do a lot at home, and that means having relatively high prices, and it means not buying from abroad for compliance purposes. But it may well be that there are additional purposes for which companies and countries will buy to go beyond the ambition that they've stated in compliance targets.
Daniele, anything? No? No. I saw a hand down in the front first, I believe. Yeah.
Sorry, maybe a naive question. Juliette Rooney-Varga from the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, USA. Just trying to get an idea of sort of the scope of emissions or the extent of emissions that may be covered under Article 6. And you're speaking to that a little bit, but I mean, yeah, it's one thing to have something like 90% of the countries saying that they may include it in their NDC or use it to fulfill their NDCs. But do you have any sense at all as to like what percentage of potential future emission reductions may come from Article 6 transactions? And then the second part of that question too is just this real concern about the potential use of negative emissions or bioenergy, where and you may be familiar with the currently many countries are calling bioenergy emissions zero, but they're really not zero, especially if they're coming from wood bioenergy. In fact, some research suggests it's worse than coal. And so that is like a concern about like how much of these emissions reductions may be coming from really questionable negative emissions or questionable, bioenergy emissions.
Bioenergy.
Michael.
Yeah, and so let's tag team. I'll start with the quantitative question. And some of this research that I portrayed in one of my slides, and I skipped very quickly over that slide, but the calculation was we have a 28 gigaton gap to get to a pathway towards 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels in terms of global average surface temperatures. And using Article 6 to its fullest potential could get us could allow us to increase ambition to close 1/4 of that gap, so roughly 7 to 8 gigatons towards 1.5. And of course you can, it would be slightly different dynamic if we're only looking at 2 degrees centigrades, but that gives you, I think, a sense of the scale.
Yeah, I think I agree that carbon markets could lead to higher ambition because of the reduced costs. I have to say our experience politically has been something else in the sense that perhaps in the EU you might see that we discovered that the ETS worked less than we thought, and therefore we increased ambition. I think the ambition was driven more by the science than necessarily that. So I agree with those figures, but again, because I'm a government representative, I have to say it all depends on the targets, right? On the quality of particular claims, I think we are very cognizant of the idea that we can't claim an offset one place while there are increases in emissions elsewhere. And we have various safeguards in the text in general terms to try and avoid that. But the devil is in the detail and the implementation of particular sectors. So it's slightly different in 6.2, where we will not see mechanisms regulated at UN level. But in 6.4, there are definitely safeguards in and around units that might actually lead to, because of leakage or however you characterize it, would lead to an increase in emissions. So, yeah.
So, Mike 3.
Yes, good evening, Matthias Honecker with Perspectives. My question is around fungibility and perhaps ties into the question previously asked in regards to negative emissions. What do the Lego pieces suggest in terms of, creating market under 6.4 that allows non-inherently permanent removals being traded against emissions reductions units as well?
Well, I mean, the agreement recognizes emissions and removals and provides for the accounting for emissions and removals under 6.2. So a removal, however you might characterize it, is something that can be accounted for. And under the mechanism too, I think we're pretty clear that removals are covered. But again, it's the details. I have to comment that we also have the concepts of avoidance, which maybe goes completely the opposite way on the table as well. But we're working through, one of our principles is that there should be no net increase in emissions within and between periods. That was an EU proposal that's been adopted. I think that has environmental integrity reasons for it with regard to the emissions themselves, but I think it also says something to the balance of emissions and removals, that it's our understanding that to get to net zero, we have to cut emissions enormously, very quickly, and then balance them with enhanced removals. And we're very conscious that the market needs to evolve and to respect the need for net enhancements and rapid removals. So the text reflects that to some extent.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. Are there? Right here.
Hi, Michaelin from Indiana University in the United States. My question is with regards to your response earlier for the question regarding ambition and coalitions. And while you stated that there are coalitions that share the desire for high ambitions, I was wondering if you could speak to, maybe would you say that the points of contention specifically within Article 6 suggest a potential future divergence for groups like G77 who have large developing nations and smaller developing nations that arguably have diverging priorities specifically with regards to ambition?
That's quite a long question. Yeah, I mean, the understanding that we've come to under Paris is that everybody is contributing according to their nationally determined contribution, and we're all contributing to the Paris goal. And we're having an argument here about whether we're contributing adequately. That's just under the mitigation goal. So I think there's an implicit criticism about ambition in your question, and I do think we have to recognize that some are able to do more, some have more potential, and some have more resources, and others are less able to do more because of the dependency. So that's a big challenge for the carbon market. The concept of a global carbon price and the concept of large transfers of resources to deliver that is something that politically is quite challenging. If you don't feel that everybody's contributing what they should. So that's my answer. I don't know if it is an answer exactly, but yeah.
I would maybe add on that, and perhaps I understood the question slightly differently. I think that indeed, you've seen traditional negotiating blocks, groupings, party groupings, G77 in China, for instance, split up, in fact, because there are differences of views between AOSIS and the LDC group and the like-minded developing countries, etc., basic. So it has definitely become a lot messier, even within what used to be on many big issues, traditionally sort of a homogenous group. And I think that speaks to your hypothesis.
So we do need to close promptly, and I don't think there's enough time for another question. So let me thank the panelists, Daniele, Martin, for your insights, and of course thank Michael for a terrific paper that has proven very useful, I think, in understanding Article 6 and the challenges that face the negotiators here at the COP. Again, if you would like to stay connected to the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, please leave your card on or in the bag over by this screen on your left, mindful that we do need to leave the room promptly in 2 minutes. Finally, let me thank the Enel Foundation for ongoing support and collaboration on this project, but also more broadly. And I hope you have a useful, productive, and enjoyable remainder of the COP.